Coming up, as the New York Football Giants roll through padded training camp, officially offensive lineman Van Roten has been signed in. We'll take a look at what it means for how the positions across the front are going to shape up for Big Blue. Also, the departure of one Aaron Robinson, the often injured player who just could not find his way. We'll talk about additional signings in the secondary and standouts as practices continue to roll along, all coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant podcast, where you know that I am one of your hosts, Adam Armbrecht, breaking it down as the New York Football Giants continue to work their way through training camp. Obviously, we expected after having Greg Van Roten in for a visit, the New York Giants, and then combined with the injury update around Evan Neal and expectations that maybe it's not that serious, he's progressing and he'll be ready when he's ready, as Brian Dable says, and then we'll get him back out there. They finally do go ahead and sign him. We also saw an additional veteran quarterback brought in here. We see Robinson go out the door. So a few different things here, moving parts as far as it goes. And then even inside of training camp, though, we're seeing Drew Phillips looking like he's really trying to claim that starting role on the inside there in the secondary. He's had some nice plays for himself. That is a big factor in terms of how we look at this roster overall. And we're going to do deeper dives on not just guys that are going to be starting, but also the depth chart. What does some of the sample sizes over the last few seasons tell us about these players, and how can we see some of the depth chart shaking out? Obviously, if you're watching us live over on YouTube right now, be sure to get us on the podcast feed as well. And something we've been telling you about just the last couple of days here, you can scan this code, check it out in the show notes as well over on YouTube. Go ahead, become an official member of OGP. Got the OGP crew and a couple other levels as well. Just things where we're trying to give a little extra value to you, the loyal fan base, as we're building towards, by the way, 3,000 subscribers on YouTube as well. Help us get over that hump. And obviously, great opportunity just for some bonus content, especially as we build towards preseason games and looking ahead to the regular season as well. So diatribe over on some of the ways that you can help this little podcast grow. When we talk about the New York Giants and Greg Van Roten bringing him in, what does it mean for the offensive line specifically? And I think it's interesting to look at, as we saw first reported by many, but Jordan Renan does a nice job covering the Giants as well. Signing Van Roten here, 34 years old. So obviously you're talking about a veteran player, 71 career starts, and then 17, though, in 2023, which obviously was a solid year for him. When you go back and look at his snap counts and his reps, it's not like this is a player. He has some injuries in his past as well, who is a model of consistency. But when you have ties to Carmen Bricillo, the new offensive line coach for the New York Football Giants, and when you have injuries on this front, as with Evan Neal and some uncertainty even about depth, it doesn't hurt to bring in an experienced player like this. The interesting thing is that they say thrown into the mix is their intentions when it comes to how they're going to use Van Roten walking in the door. Brian Dable, he was seen in a jersey, no pads at practice today, was Van Roten as the Giants worked their way through training camp. But we already kind of had a few different things here. So started extensively at right guard last year, but also as left guard in his back pocket. Go back to the Hard Knocks episodes. We'll have a fresh one of those tonight. We'll be talking about it tomorrow on the show. When we think about looking at how they talked about Joe Shane saying in free agency, going after a player like Illuminor and saying, if we get him, that's our right guard or right tackle. So it was not only an indication of maybe where they envisioned utilizing him, but also about that safety net when it came to Evan Neal. So now the question becomes, you're already seeing kicking around Illuminor over to the right tackle position with Evan Neal down. There's some interesting conversations about what it means for Evan Neal. And I don't know why it's maybe as big of a talking point as it's being turned into, shy of saying, hey, obviously a 7th overall pick that through injury and through performance, it does not look like he's long for the New York Football Giants. But if you're going to kick around Illuminor to the right tackle, now it just becomes, okay, there's a player that has a lot of experience at both guard positions in Van Roten, but you also heard the Giants when they talk about John Runyon Jr. and his preference of where he might prefer to play. So my expectation, we'll find out as the days come and you start to work him into the mix here. If I had to say it right now, my inclination would be that you see Runyon maybe swing around to the left guard, and then you end up plugging in Van Roten at the right guard position, at least in the short term. And you talk about being in the mix for the New York Giants. Listen, there is a lot of possibilities here, but it's not like you can stand up and say automatically player X, Y, or Z is going to plug in. Shy of Andrew Thomas, shy obviously of John Michael Schmitz going into year number 2. But overall, there is fluidity in these other 3 positions. And it comes down to not only having an experienced guy like Van Roten enter into the mix now, but it also comes down to who has been behind them. And we've talked about this before. When you get into the offensive line and we start thinking about who's going to be the backups in these roles. Something we haven't talked a lot about the center position because John Michael Schmitz, year number 2, you want that to be obviously a staple. But as far as injuries are concerned, you have 2 veteran players that have been around the league in Schlotzman and in Morrissey, both their 28 and 26-year-old respectively behind him. But then when you get into the guard room, and we talked about Zudu a lot because if you want to have one of these guys, one of the Joe Shane draft picks, finally come to fruition, Izudu at least has been given some of that sample size, been given some of those opportunities to continue to grow. Unlike when you think about a Marcus McKathan, who, while we have some optimism around him, he's had some injuries, but we haven't seen him get there. Remember, a year ago, they were using Matt Pert as the backup swing tackle, which shocked everybody, I think, across the board. So when you get into this room now, it's not just about, okay, are we going to have Andrew Thomas, let's just say Thomas, Runyon Jr., John Michael Schmitz, Van Roten, and Illuminor. Okay, that's great. But in terms of players are going to miss reps, your injuries are inevitable here. You see it every single year, not just the Giants, across the league, especially on the line. Now you get into Jalen Mayfield, and I mentioned Marcus McKathan, Izudu. Are these guys ready to at least be in those backup roles to some extent? We know that Aaron Stinney was signed. He's a veteran, 30-year-old guard to be put into the mix there as well. And then when you get into the offensive tackles, I mean, listen, while we may feel like the incredibly low bar that was set by Evan Neal in his play on the field since being drafted is so low that anything above him is going to be an improvement, you're still saying, okay, is Illuminor ready to plug in and at least be serviceable in that role? And who's going to be behind him? Marcellus Johnson, Miles, Nelson, Kajust, like they're just names in that room, and you need to have a backup swing tackle no matter what. So fleshing those out is going to be really interesting. And I will say, just on a high level from an Evan Neal standpoint, because I mentioned his name there, there's a couple of things. First off, and we said this going back, and frankly, this signing of Van Roten, by the way, tells you everything you need to know. And we don't listen when we're wrong about stuff. We'll tell you when we feel like we're right about it. We'll give ourselves a little pat on the back. Andy may be wrong about Azeez Ojulari, right? We've had that discussion on the show. But when we talked about what does it mean for Evan Neal and maybe kicking him inside, I consistently said I just do not see the world where you fail at right tackle and overall you've had a struggle to start your career. So the solution is going to be kick you inside and see if you can go ahead and carve yourself out a role. Not coming into a year like this. It's year number 4 for the Shane Daboll ticket. They need to figure out and they need to show ownership that we have figured some things out here. So while you could talk about in a backup role capacity, sure, you want to get any kind of value you can out of Neal. I always thought that if he wasn't going to be able to play through injury or performance at right tackle, it was going to be about how do we fix this offensive line? How do we make this a consistent offensive line entering the season? And I don't think even in backup roles or even in open competition roles, you were going to sit there and say, well, maybe Evan Neal will claim a role. And especially even now, the one thing I'll give you in this example, now I'm talking about putting in Van Roten on the right side. So if you were to do that, and then you have Evan Neal and Illuminor claims and keeps and maintains that starting role at right tackle, the world where because of age of Van Roten, maybe there's a world where Evan Neal, not with any level of expectations right now, but maybe over the course of this season, just getting reps in the background can put himself in a decent position. Typically, when you talk about high draft capital that gets used on a player who doesn't come to fruition, who does not become a starter and key piece for your offensive line, they don't come back on next contracts, right? They leave, they go somewhere else, someone takes a flyer on them, and they see what can happen. And I wonder if maybe in the big picture here, that might be the Evan Neal path forward is, hey, can I just try to show that I'm capable? Can I be a decent backup at any position for the Giants? And then as I go forward, someone that wants to take a flyer says, hey, the pedigree was there once, maybe a new position, XYZ, we can get some value out of them. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the offensive line, while it's on paper right now, this has to feel as good as you can in recent years about what the consistency should be for the New York Football Giants. If you told me right now that it was going to be Thomas, Runyon Jr., JMS, Van Roten, Illuminor, I'd feel pretty good about that. Now, you can see some of the reports from today's practice and Daniel Jones and the struggles, and that's going to happen in camp. But ultimately, will it matter if the QB play is bad? Will it matter if you can't get guys open? All that stuff? Of course not. But at least it feels like they tried the route of drafting and grooming players to take on these positions. Those didn't work out. And I think if you had gone back to the well one time too many, if you had gone into this offseason, if we had heard on Hard Knocks that the Giants were prioritizing retaining Saquon Barkley and not thinking that the offensive line, which would be shocking, needed sincere and serious attention, that'd be a really hard pill to swallow. So going with veterans and going with experience and feeling like you have a track record, that matters. Going with guys that have ties to Bricillo, that matters, because if we're going to turn over that coaching position and feel like that coach is going to not only maximize our play overall across the line, but also be able to have the connections with a couple of these key figures, yeah, that really matters. Like, that is something that we have to, at least in theory, put real stock into and say, okay, it was the coaching staff combined with some misses on young talent, but now we have experience on both counts. Let's have this be more consistent than it's been in the past. We'll take a little look over here in just 1 second at some of the shout outs coming in. Anyone watching live over on YouTube, always appreciate you guys. And we'll go ahead and dive into those coming up here in just one moment. And as we continue today's OGP live session, Tuesday edition, training camp, Hard Knocks, final episode coming up later tonight. We'll, of course, be discussing that. We let you know this episode is also brought to you by Pietential, P-I-E-T-E-N-T-I-A-L. That is Pietential.com. It is a free for individual users online assessment tool, sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve over time, and also tracks your progress. It's a great way to make sure that day-to-day you're maintaining the goals you have, the attitudes and approaches that you want to have to those goals, and just kind of keeping an even keel. It's something that maybe Evan Neal will be investing in as he tries to come back from an injury and also tries to carve a role out for himself on this team. Inside the conversation with one of our frequent flyers, Side Guy Bryce. So do we need to sign a veteran QB to replace cornerback, to replace Aaron Robinson? Well, technically, whether or not you want where you want to put him in the category, the Giants did sign. We actually intended to talk about this yesterday, but we did not get to him, and that's Breon Borders, the 29-year-old veteran who the Giants brought in. So there's a weird, what's the one-to-one here? Did you bring in Borders because you intended to release Robinson? Did you release Robinson because you were going to sign Van Roten? Either way, the Giants went ahead and brought in a veteran cornerback who, by and large, has special teams reps in his background. You're not going to go look at his stats and see anything flashy or think that he's going to be a player that walks in the door and has some type of larger, consistent role. It'll be interesting to see. The one reality that I think we talk about, and we saw this actually going back, if you think about in the secondary right now, obviously Xavier McKinney leaves, they draft Tyler Nubin, but they also went out and brought in another veteran in Jalen Mills at the time to try to bolster that group. Now, they're listing him as cornerback. I think he's better suited as safety, but he has some flexibility there. That's a 30-year-old veteran being brought into the room, a 29-year-old veteran in Borders being brought into the room. The players that you think about, if we're going to flip over to the secondary for a little bit here, which Side Guy Bry has inspired me to do so, you're going to think about players that they brought back, like Isaiah Simmons, a weapon, versatility. You still have Elijah Riley back there, 26 years old, Pinnock 25, 24 for Javarius Owens, older side, even though he's still only going to be coming into the league here in his second season. And then obviously it's the rookie Tyler Nubin, but he's already 23 years old as well. Older rookies were brought in here, even on the offensive side, and a player like Theo Johnson as well. So, and then you have Dane Belton there too at 23. But I think one of the things that we're seeing here again, when we talk about who's coming, who's going, who's being brought in to this organization, we always go back to who are Joe Schoen guys, who are Dave Gettleman guys, and continuing to wean them out. And that's what's happening now. More and more, they're continuing to wean themselves out. I see your other comment there, so I got no need to apologize. We're here to have the conversation. What's happening with the Giants? What are they doing? What are the moves, right? So breaking them all down. So, but what it feels like to me is, and Van Roten is an example of this too, even at 34 years old, and an area of need, clearly. But the Giants are now kind of transitioning again when you go back and look at some of these players drafted. And by the way, Aaron Robinson, I mean, if we go back and look, I'm trying to remember what his total line was, right? 11 total games played. And that, there was once upon a time when he looked like a player that could have value. And who knows, maybe they'll bring him back into the mix here in some form or fashion. But it's hard to look back to a player taken in the third round for the Giants and not find a way to have them still have a role. And injuries play a big factor in that. And we've seen that happen over the years for the New York Football Giants. But when you continue to look at this roster, it has just been a slow weaning process of former draft picks, whether they're high caliber talents like Xavier McKinney or Saquon Barkley that move on with big contracts, or lower end guys that work their way through. Darnay Holmes still being on this roster is fascinating because he went from being a player in that regime who was supposed to take over that nickel corner spot and really be a starter and a staple. Didn't work out. So they start to transition away from that, but he carves out a role for himself in special teams. So you're always trying to find how are guys going to give you value. And if you are one of those players, you also have to look at and say, how do I make sure that I maximize my value for this team? Because I got to find a way to get there when it comes to still making sure that I can have a role. And even if it's going to be moving on from here eventually, just showing that I have consistency and some versatility. Another one that we'll get to here, we turn our attention back to it. Neal, I see you up there in the conversation going back to the offensive line. But just to tie a bow on it, moves in the background being made, questions being asked. And if we want to just say, as we talk about Robinson being cut, one of the positives coming out of camp right now is that Drew Phillips looks like he's trying to claim that role. And he looks pretty darn consistent and looks like a player that at the time of the draft, we'd say, oh, okay, is this the guy, right? And we haven't gone back yet, which I think is something fun to do before we get into preseason games and just remember, hey, what could have been working our way through the first round, getting into the second round, all of those cornerbacks coming off the board. You turn around, you make the pivot. Was the intention to have another elite outside corner to play across from Banks? Probably. But then when you start to get more into best player available and elevating positions of need still, get a guy like Drew Phillips. If he continues to stand out, that really does matter. Like it's going to play a big role in having some consistency before we start to turn our attention to what's happening on the outside. McLeod is getting reps. We're seeing obviously Cordell Flott. You want to have him be a part of this mix here. You'd love to see him claim the role. So there's still a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the outside cornerback room, the depth of that room. We're going to go through that, I think, like at length here as we work our way through training camp, because I said this early in the offseason, there's some ideas of someone will step up and claim this role, and we'll have our starters across the board. Obviously, Banks is already locked in, and we've been seeing great back and forth with him and Malik Neighbors working each other and making each other better. But is it one guy's going to claim that role? Or is it that we're kind of going in the very situational direction? Now, maybe Drew Phillips does, and that would be incredible, right? Back end, secondary, different story. We already have Pinnock. Feel pretty good about Tyler Nubin. We're curious about Dane Belton. A lot of guys trying to, carve out their roles for themselves. But I just wonder if it's going to be a lot of situational football and a lot of mixing and matching of personnel until somebody really steps up and really claims that starting role where you say, hey, when we go and watch the tape, rep over rep, week over week, this player stands out as the most consistent, and he's earned that opportunity to be the consistent starter. Up until that point, though, it does become fascinating about how the Giants look at it. We'll go ahead and just throw this one in here as we transition a little bit back over to the offensive side as well, having the conversation. From Neal, Gettleman did hit on Thomas and Lawrence, but boy, did he have some duds. Yes, of course. And I mean, listen, though, if you went and looked at that, and we had this conversation for a little bit, going back to like last year, I think, talking about Gettleman and saying, hey, Thomas, Dexter Lawrence, these are cornerstone pieces now for you. Like that counts for something. But then you remember, who he signed, money that was spent, and all of the misses that he had in there along the way. If I went in and looked at the Giants draft picks, I always love to do these type of negotiations here in real time when looking back on what the Giants have done year over year. And the misses, as you mentioned there accurately, Dave Gettleman, the misses that he had on his ledger were a ton, right? We know that. But if you go back and think about, so year number one coming in for Dave Gettleman, oh, sorry, not Dave Gettleman, for Joe Shane, listen, I can throw you down a laundry list of names. How about Darian Beavers, Marcus McCathan, DJ Davidson? Those are question marks. Micah McFadden, it looks like he's really emerging and stepping up in that role. Having a KRK there is great. Dane Belton, question mark. Daniel Bellinger, question mark. Cordell Flott, hey, looks like he's getting a big opportunity here. We'll see. Izudu, still a question mark. Wandale Robinson, good hit. Obviously, Neal is a seismic miss. And then you have Kayvon Thibodeau as well. And that, to me, is interesting because when you go back and think about it, you really are that massive 2022 year was so substantial in terms of the number of players that you had in there. Now, listen, you get 2 in the 3rd round in Izudu and Flott, and this becomes a critical year to gauge about whether or not they are successful ultimately. But when you get into the back end, you think about games played for Bellinger and Belton and McFadden, that's 4th and into the 5th rounders there. Hey, 25, 29, 32, 33 games getting played. You're starting to see some of that success. You're starting to see a sample of what could be. It's fascinating as they enter into these like 3rd years where you go, but now, if you take that next step this year, then a lot of these guys become confirmed hits. But there's the other way that it goes where we don't think, but Cordell Flott struggles on the outside and can't quite put it all together. Okay, that's a 3rd round pick, 81st overall, that didn't pan out for you. And when you continue to fast forward it, Eric Gray doesn't look like that's going to work out. And again, these are later round picks. Trey Hawkins, Jordan Riley, Javarius Owens. These are just bodies. It's 5 through 7. Don't think they're going to all hit, but right now it doesn't look like any of them are going to hit. So those are misses, right? But the top 3 in 2023 draft class in Banks, in Schmitz, and in Hyatt look like they are going to progress in the right direction. Already locked in with Banks. Can Schmitz be that guy? Can Hyatt show up and do that? And then you have this year's draft class as well. But dialing it back to the era of Dave Gettleman, well, Kadarius Toney, we all understand that. Azeez Ojulari, we don't know. The injuries, the production has been there when healthy, but the injuries are a factor there. Robinson not on the team anymore. Ellison Smith not on the team anymore. Gary Brightwell not on the team anymore. Rodarius Williams not on the team anymore. And back it up one more year. Now, Xavier McKinney, that's a hit. It's a success, but he's no longer with the team. You mentioned Andrew Thomas. Matt Pert, no. Darnay Holmes has a role, but you maybe at 110 is special teamer and depth contributor. Is that enough? Maybe. Shane Lemieux not here anymore. Cam Brown not here anymore. Carter Coughlin holding on. 7th round pick. That's fine. And these are all 7th rounders. So you really don't worry about any of those guys not being a part of the team anymore. But then as you dial back one more time, this is what I love to do it, guys. Oh, I hope you're listening on the podcast. I hope you're watching on YouTube and just really loving when I go completely off the rails and start backing up draft classes year over year. But back into that Daniel Jones year, Dexter Lawrence was the hit. DeAndre Baker, not here anymore. Zimenez, not here. Julian Love, signed away, veteran. You can definitely put him down as a hit. Ryan Connolly, Darius Slayton, that's a hit. Corey Ballantyne doesn't work out. I don't know. Again, it's a lot more of the everything than just the one or the other. BJ Hill is a hit from the 2018 class, signed elsewhere. Lorenzo Carter not here. Will Hernandez, okay. Saquon Barkley, obviously a hit, but not the right pick that you want to be making at that time. So all in all, it's not so much about the hits or the misses for any GM, let alone Gettleman or let alone Joe Schoen. It's about the totality of what you put together and whether or not you end up having a cohesive roster. And to this point, while I think the money management and the allocation of funds has been much smarter under Joe Schoen, we're still waiting for all of those things to come together. We're still waiting for that to be the turning point where we look at this year and go, oh, okay, Illuminor and Runyon and Van Roten on a very short term because he's 34 years old, but okay, consistency. And John Michael Schmitz works out. Okay. Now, next year's draft class, you bring in one more guy, and now you're looking at that Thomas, JMS, and player to be named later as the core going forward. Got to keep rolling over that offensive line and having consistency year over year. We did that laundry list a few episodes ago where I ran through all of the turnover that the Giants had across the offensive line year over year. Just a lack of consistency. And we know you go back to the Super Bowl runs, there was so much year over year consistency. And even in sometimes making changes like with David Deal, you just rolled him right down the line, kept changing his position, and he kept plugging in and kept playing and kept providing stability, consistency, and familiarity. So those are the things that we really want here. I'll give another shout out here as Charles K comes in the door. Missing on a pick like Evan Neal is an absolute killer for the Giants. I don't blame the GM as his floor is supposed to be the potential starter. Yeah, I mean, listen, somebody pointed this out the other day, too, in the YouTube comments where we always appreciate whether we're live or otherwise, that at the time, the pedigree was there, the prospect was there. So it's not like it's not an association. I'll frame it in the way of Dave Gettleman. When he drafted Saquon Barkley, it wasn't about the pedigree or the player. It was about the point that you took him at and whether or not there was better value there. In this instance, hey, it plugged and played. Now, the only thing you can remind yourself is that Joe Schoen at the time, he said, it was either way. If we get Thibodeau now, and then we'll take whatever offensive lineman is available. Now, again, Neal's pedigree was there, but there were other options. And regardless of if you preferred Neal or not, I don't like the idea of like a little bit of ambiguity in that regard, going back to that draft class. Whereas, again, they will take whoever. That shouldn't be the case. I think you should always have a preference of who you want. Now, if they're marginally right there and you're happy with either, okay, fine. But I like it better when you say, we're taking Thibodeau here because we want Thibodeau here. And then we're excited about either one of those offensive linemen that comes out. It's all hashing out a little bit of the background noise anyway. That being the case, back to the top just briefly. Van Roten gets brought in. My assumption, at least on the face right now in this moment, would be Thomas, Runyon Jr., JMS, Van Roten, Illuminor. Because now you get two guys that have familiarity with Bricillo, familiarity with one another, going back to the Raiders. Okay, so now you get that consistency on the right side of the line. You have veterans around your second year center, and now you try to move forward. And Andrew Thomas is obviously the plug-and-play elite tackle that he is. I want to see, though, whether I'm right or wrong on the positioning across this line. I cannot come out of training camp and out of the preseason games, as limited as those reps may be. I cannot come out of those games, out of this preseason, out of this training camp, and walk into week 1 with a starting 5-man lineup that I do not see again in week 2 and again in week 3. Too much, even in the Joe Schoen era. It's been too much. Well, maybe we'll move him over here. Maybe we'll shuffle this player there. Maybe we'll try player XYZ. Maybe we'll have a rotational cast. And Brian Daboll has acknowledged, like, we don't want to do that, but we felt like we were trying to find the right combinations. These need to be, by and large, the right combinations of players. These need to be the guys that are consistently out there week over week. That's good for whether you care or not Daniel Jones as the starting quarterback, but it's good for the run game and Devin Singletary and having that consistency. It's good for pass protection, run protection, passing off assignments. The consistency that you provide here is important. And even for the guys behind them, by the way. If you know, if you are Joshua Ezeudu and your role is going to be the backup guard, then that's where you get your reps. Week over week, you're there with some of those other players that you may have to step up with. You're there learning underneath two veterans if that's going to be your role. Okay. Not, hey, this week you may see 30% of the reps on the field. Next week, no reps. The week after, 60% of the reps. And by the way, when you get those reps at different varying degrees, you're going to see it at left guard. Maybe you're going to see it over at right guard. Maybe you'll see it at right tackle. Maybe for 2 plays, we're going to put you at position X. The Giants did that in this era. Under Brian Daboll, they had games where they were rotating offensive linemen actively in their positions in game, in drives. That cannot be the way that a NFL level starting offensive line operates. So that for me is the biggest thing that I need to have happen here. It doesn't mean that these guys are going to be Pro Bowlers, but consistency and week over week consistency is what matters most to me in my mind. And because, by the way, it also then gives you a clear picture about where you are with your personnel, who's succeeding or failing. And again, the dirty name that nobody wants to mention in Daniel Jones, whether or not he has good or bad practices throughout the course of training camp or looks a little shaky here or there, or wins and losses, touchdowns, fumbles, interceptions, whatever the case may be. If there's any part of the Giants organization, which whether fans want to or admit or not, there is some amount that is saying if he shows up and plays pretty good this year, then that means that we will keep him around. Even if we end up drafting a quarterback of the future, we may still pick up that tab and pay that out over the next 2 years, because as all these other quarterbacks keep getting paid, his keeps falling down. Even if it's still more than he should get paid, he's down to be the 14th, 15th highest paid quarterback. And then give it another year, he'll be the 16th, 17th paid quarterback, right? Like, so it doesn't matter anymore. It looked hideous when you gave it to him initially, and then the product on the field didn't look good, and then the injuries as well. But at least you'll be able to get that sense, not only of his play and what his short-term value may be as a bridge quarterback over the remainder of his contract, potentially, but also that the offensive line is ready to have a rookie plugged in behind them, if that's the case. Are we going to be able to go into next offseason and say, Thomas, Runyon, JMS, need a new right guard because Illuminor is going to stay at right tackle in the short term. We're going to keep him there. Or are we going to go into the draft and take a right tackle and kick Illuminor into guard, right? But if we can get down to the place where after a season of growth and consistency, where we then can turn our head over and give ourselves the opportunity to say, we only have to correct or fix one more player, right? One more position of need. That's what you want. That's the dream here for the Giants. And on paper right now, it looks like it's ready to have that opportunity this year. On paper. Doesn't always come to fruition. One more here. I could see a restructure from Charles K doubling down. No way Jones has the external market. Yeah, maybe, but why would he? I mean, the contract's the contract. The money's the money. Now, does he play well enough where we're getting these weird conversations of, hey, we're going to go ahead and talk about extension and then shrinking that money down? I can't go that far in this moment right now, but there's just no reason for Daniel Jones to restructure. The Giants cutting him, it's still going to cost them massive dead hit to get out from underneath that contract. So while they go to him and say, hey, you want to restructure, stick around and play football, or we're going to outright cut you, there is a punitive cost there for the Giants as well. So there's going to be a lot of variables. That's a little bit further down the road, though I like the conversation, Charles, one that we'll obviously continue to keep our eye on. That being the case, the big news of the day is that Greg Van Roten, 34-year-old veteran, has been signed, played extensively at right guard a year ago with the Raiders. Expectations, at least for me, would be that that's where he would plug in. But as Brian Daboll said, we'll put him in the mix and see how it shakes out. I can at least like the versatility you have between Illuminor, Runyon Jr., and now Van Roten to say, let's go ahead and find the combinations that add up and make sense for us. And then let's go ahead and, again, set the roster, set that lineup, and move forward, knowing what we have across the line 1 through 5. We will, of course, continue to talk about, there's a QB conversation that I do want to have. Andy and I may have it tomorrow, maybe later in the week, just about expectations. Tommy DeVito came out and said, hey, they're going to regret not keeping me around if the Giants chose to move on from him. And it made me chuckle. And then it also made me think, well, let's just look back, right? We have baseline understandings about what's going on inside the QB room in terms of bad offensive line play and having Barkley or not and weapons or not. I don't know. How do all these guys stack up? Where is Drew Lock in that mix? And could anything happen over the course of this season to make the Giants feel differently about it? So we're going to have some fun with that one as well. And I'll throw this one out here too. I'm not exactly sure when their practices are prob 1:33, close to getting done here. We did see, if you joined in late over on YouTube, made mention of Drew Phillips having some good reps out there. Obviously, looking to claim a starting role for himself. We continue to see some good battles on the interior, on the offensive line, and where those reps have looked. But by and large, we just want to come in and have the conversation about where we stand across this offensive line with the Van Roten signing. And then I should have put, Rotten signed, could add that Van in there. But we will continue to break down what we saw from practice. Again, tomorrow, last episode of Hard Knocks. So it's going to be fun to watch how the team went through the draft, how Tyler Nubin, when you get there and the cornerbacks have come off the board, but he's arguably the best safety there. What did that feel like in the room? So there's going to be some fun things, but it's interesting how the offseason Hard Knocks coverage is now like, it's just right there where we're turning our page here. Like, we have a season ahead. So while, yes, it'll be fun to see how Tyler Nubin came to be a Giant, how Drew Phillips came to be a Giant. That is fun. But we're already getting into these waters where I need to be watching these guys in training camp, right? And thankfully, with Drew Phillips looking good and putting some good reps out there, I like the fact that we're going to see, how did he become a Giant? How excited were the Giants to get him? For guys that maybe look a little shaky or have some growing to do, that feels a little bit different. The last thing that we'll remind you, as we did at the top as well, and I appreciate you guys allowing me to say it, if you go over right now to YouTube, if you're watching us obviously live or listening to us later on the podcast feed, you can scan the code up on the screen right now. You can also go look in the show notes. The link will be there too. Join the OGP crew. It's a way to kind of just give us a little bit of extra support. And then there's a couple of levels to it. You can check out some of the features, bonus perks, extra content. When we get to the regular season, we'll go into more detail about what our intentions are in terms of how we want to cover the Giants week over week. Really want to dial ourselves in and give specific opponent coverage, matchup coverage, and things that we think are going to really matter in games. So we're trying to dial this in here. We have some new partnerships that we're working with as well. Any way that you choose to support us means the world to us. So please be sure to check that out. In the meantime, YouTube, alerts, live episodes, obviously, like we're doing here today. And then, of course, over on the podcast feed, the little extra thing you do. If you get the chance to put a 5-star review in, please, please, please do it. Subscribe to that podcast feed. It's the other element that we're trying to make sure we ramp up and build right along with our YouTube channel. So again, could not be any more appreciative of the support we've had so far. We're pushing our way towards 3,000 subscribers on YouTube. Help us get there as well. And then again, talking Hard Knocks, talking training camp, full pads, and maybe taking a little speculative look, as Lawrence Cager did have a little bit of an injury hiccup there. He went down yesterday at practice. So we're going to go inside that tight end room as well and talk about rookies and injuries and retired players and some of that speculation around what the Giants maybe want to do there as they work their way through camp and preseason as well. However, until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, nay, and demand the people know if he were here, as always, let's go Big Blue.